I haven't spoken to smart people in a while, so I'm excited to come back and have great conversations with people who are shaping the world. And today I have a very fascinating man who I have met only once. I met him in Kenya a few years back. I think he will remember that. His name is Alexander Hammond. He's a senior fellow at African Liberty, a colleague of mine. Alex, great to see you, sir. On the screen, a long time we last met in Nairobi. Um, Tell us, what else do you do other than being a senior fellow at African Liberty, my brother?
Well, thank you, Phumlani. It's great to be back and talking to you. Yeah, we'll never forget the first time we meet, or indeed when we meet again in the future, hopefully soon. So as well as being a senior fellow at African Liberty, I created an organization called the Initiative for African Trade and Prosperity, the IATP. And this is a project that is of the University of Buckingham and the Institute of Economic Affairs, which is a London-based think tank, the first free market think tank in the UK. And what I do is the IATP works with about a dozen African think tanks, and we support them in their outputs related to trade and economic freedom. This can take many forms. It can be doing our own research papers with these organizations. It can be helping to edit their articles, or it can be small grants to fund events, to fund policy briefs, to really get the message out there. We're focusing on free trade at the moment just because of the urgency around the African continental free trade area. But we do lots of stuff, and including doing interviews like this with people like yourself.
Yeah. So tell me, before we get into the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken coming to Africa this week, how is the free trade agreement doing? How do you see it? Are things in progress? What do you think? Are there any stumbling blocks? Where are we right now for some people who haven't kept up with the issue?
Yeah, things are going pretty well. As everyone will know, the potential benefits of a free trade area are enormous. There are millions of people out of extreme poverty, but even the most pessimistic predictions and estimates from a World Bank, they predict 30 million people out of extreme poverty in just 13 years. Things are going pretty well. Some negotiations have kind of stalled. The main holdups are related to rules of origin. And the custom mechanisms within between African states on rules of origin means imagine goods are coming from India to Rwanda, and then these goods in India, they can't travel freely around Africa as part of a free trade area because they're Indian goods, they're not African goods. So rules of origin is essentially, how do we figure out that these goods are Indian goods and not Rwandan goods? And the problem is for many African states, when they trade across the borders, they just lack the mechanisms to do so and to do this effectively. So that could be a stumbling block. More broadly, there is just a general worry that, okay, we've got 43 of the 55 African Union members ratified the agreement, which is incredible. That's something of this scale has never happened before. However, then you look at the actions of, say, Egypt, South Africa, Nigeria. Those alone are the key African states. They make up a third, 50% of the African GDP. And yet, are they really implementing policies that are free trade friendly, that show us that they want to remove tariffs by 90%, which you're meant to do under the free trade area? Probably not. I mean, Nigeria's border was closed for about slightly less than 2 years before COVID, just because they were basically scared of competition. It was only partially reopened. South Africa's pursuing the localization policies, which I'm sure you know far more about than I do. So for me, that's the biggest worry. But generally, things are looking quite good. I mean, especially if we compare to, say, 60 years ago, the Organization of African Unity was created to push African socialism. That was its founding principle, according to Nkrumah and Nyerere and the other leaders at the time. Whereas today, the successor of that organization, the African Union, they've created the world's largest free trade area. And they're all many leaders are describing themselves as avid free traders. And even Ramaphosa has described himself as such. And sure, we can say we don't believe him because his actions don't follow suit. But it is interesting. There's an ideological shift that has happened. And even if progress is slow, there is something there. But broadly, it's getting there. I think the next year will be really, really telling. No trade has actually happened, though, under the 90% of tariffs being removed yet. There's a lot more that needs to be done.
Yeah. And then Anthony Blinken is here, the US Secretary of State. He's on the trip visiting Africa. He was here in South Africa. I think he left today, if I'm not mistaken. And then he will be in Rwanda as well, and DR Congo. Is there any significance in his trip, Alex? Is it adding any value? Is it something that can help Africa? What is your view on this trip?
Well, it seems a lot of government officials are heading to Africa in the last month or two.
Yeah, I wonder what your thoughts are on that. What are they trying to? Why are they coming here in big numbers? These guys from Russia, France as well.
Macron as well.
Now,
Yeah.
US.
So, of course, there's geopolitical tensions, both surrounding China, which was part of this Africa strategy, which Blinken unveiled at the University of Pretoria the other day. I think it was yesterday, maybe 2 days once this recording goes up. And I think it's trying to be about winning friends and influencing folk, right? There's been a huge amount, I think, of disinformation from Russia. It's just since the war broke out. Many African states are refusing to condemn Russia's actions. You couple that with Chinese tensions in Taiwan, following Pelosi's visit to Taiwan recently. It's clear that the West, if you want to call it that, and the East are basically seeing who their friends are on the continent, who they can rely on. And in terms of, say, Russia, a lot of African states refused to condemn it at the UN vote recently. South Africa abstained from voting and has refused to condemn it. So there's a lot of interesting tensions. And in a way, you do wonder if we're going back to the days of the Cold War, but this time with the greater focus being on China than the USSR. What do you make of it?
Well, I'm very much in agreement with the view that we've entered Cold War II. Now it's between China and the US. For me, what troubles me, Alex, at this point is that I'm not sure Africa will be able to handle this Cold War if it gets worse, because I don't think it's in our interest. You have been speaking earlier about the free trade agreement. It's a great idea. It has to work. It needs to be implemented. We need to create an environment that facilitates that that this agreement succeeds. But if the global tensions, Alex, they take another negative, different turn, then it's going to affect even the agreements, like the free trade agreement that we've sort of initiated or started working on as the African continent. I am also not, I would hate for this thing to get to a point where we get back to Cold War I, where basically nations or nation states had to somehow pick a side, right? You are either, following the line of the Soviet Union, or you are following the line of the United States. I would hate that because when you look at Africa, it's the biggest creditor of Africa. It's China now, Alex. Our biggest creditor is China. We also have relations with the United States and the EU. We are trading with them. We have the AGOA program. I think you know that program quite well, where we are trading with the US and getting benefits there as countries across the the African continent. And China is, if I'm not mistaken, Africa's biggest trader as well, when it comes to trading. So imagine Africa having to find itself in the middle of this kind of tension where it's being somehow pressured or forced to pick a side. I think that would be quite destructive. So this kind of Cold War is not in Africa's interest, and it's not something that can do us any good. But to throw it back to you, what are in your view, what is it that the U.S. Secretary of State, Blinken, how is it supposed to approach things for the benefit of Africans? Yes, there's a war going on. There is geopolitical interests that have to take place. But if he were to do something that he, for example, believed that it's something that would benefit Africans, what are the areas? You mean we are a trade guy? Could it be trade? Could it be security? What are the fundamental issues he could work with that could advance, Africans?
Oh, there's so many. And the frustrating thing is when you've studied this area for a while, you see these Africa strategies come out every year, and it's just more of the same. And sure, it's good in this Africa strategy. The elephant in the room of China was finally addressed. Last year, Blinken says that they didn't want to limit Africa's partnership with other states, but now he's being a bit more confrontational, saying he kind of sees China in Africa, Chinese activity in Africa as an arena to undermine the international order and weaken relations. So it's good as being addressed, but it's all these strategies are just lacking any real substance. They claim they want to support Africa, help it develop economically, build closer ties, but then all these policies are just so lacking anything substantive. There's tons they can do. We mentioned AGOA, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. And that is, for those that don't know, it's an act between the US and now 36 sub-Saharan African states. And it means that these states can export duty-free about 6,500 products to the US market. And trade under that has been fairly successful. I mean, it was introduced in 2001, I think it was, 2002. And since then, growth between Africa and the AGOA states in the US has grown by about 300%. And it really did peak in like 2008, but that's due to America's reliance on foreign oil. However, AGOA excludes some key industries. For example, sugar isn't included on it, tobacco, peanuts, beef, dairy. There's all these products that are then subject to duties that aren't duty-free. And this just frustrates me because if the US truly cared about helping Africans and enriching the continent's economy, get rid of those tariffs, absolutely do duty-free on all the products. And indeed, with the products I mentioned, like sugar, tobacco, peanuts, beef, dairy, that have these tariffs on, the US Congressional Research Service itself has admitted that concerns regarding tariffs on these products, even among American producers, they say it would be generally limited because of the low volume coming from Africa and because the US doesn't produce too much of this anyway. So that's just one thing. Another thing, subsidies. I'm really against subsidies, especially agricultural subsidies. The US pumps huge amounts of money into subsidies, about, I think, between 2019 and 2023, almost $500 billion, huge amounts. And what this does is it makes commodities on the global market cheaper than they otherwise be. They artificially lower the price. Now, this can get a bit boring and economicsy, but by artificially lowering the price, it means if you're an African producer who's making that same product or growing that same crop, you are going to get less money. So therefore, it's quite obvious, if they are lowering the price of these goods and African producers are getting less money, therefore, oh, my lights are off. Therefore, what that means is African producers are being kept in poverty. Many millions are being kept in poverty because of Western subsidies. Now, what does that mean? If tens of millions of African farmers are being kept in poverty, you could easily say that Western subsidies are killing thousands of Africans each year, right? Because if you're in extreme poverty, you can't afford medicines, maybe you don't have enough food to eat, you can't visit the hospital when you need to. So that is something I'm very passionate about. And it's a very bipartisan issue. Brookings Institution, which is fairly centre-left, agrees that it should be reduced. Heritage, Cato, so many organizations across the political aisle say huge amounts, hundreds of millions would be added if these subsidies were removed to Africa's economy, and tens of millions would be lifted out of poverty and thousands of lives saved. So they're just a couple of ones, and we can dig into China's growth as well, if you want, on the continent. But I'll just turn the light on.
Light's back now.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay, great. So now, you've just mentioned China. Just to take it the conversation toward China a bit. I know I had invited you to talk about Blinken, but let's talk about China as well a bit. Do you think is China a problem in Africa? Is it something? The influence of China, its role in China, China's role in Africa, that has grown now massively over time. Is it something that we should be concerned about, the role of China?
Well, it's a really complicated issue, and it's quite interesting because army experts have spent their careers dedicated to this issue. And regardless of whether they're conservative, libertarian, or liberal, they come away with completely different answers. Some say we do have to be really worried. Some say, not so much. But what is interesting about Chinese, at least investment in Africa, is most of it, if not all of it, is driven, of foreign direct investment, is driven by the interests of the Chinese government, right? And not the commercial interests of the private sector. And this means, therefore, that Chinese investment is far more likely to back projects that will never make a profit. And doing so will just load governments with debt. And a great example of that is this railway in Kenya. And in 2014, the Kenyan government tried to find bidders for it. And the World Bank immediately looked at it and said, no, this will never become profitable. Don't invest in it. So what happened? All the private sector entrepreneurs, and indeed those in the West, just rejected, wouldn't invest in it. But China instantly invested in it. And it cost about 3.2 billion to start with. There was delays and expansions, and it cost almost $5 billion. And it's built now, yet it continues to lose $200 million each year. And that's a problem, because it just shows China doesn't care about profit on these projects. And they're just kind of doing it to build a voting client block at the UN, and they're looking for a way to spend money and also potentially employ Chinese workers abroad. But the issue we should think about is, whose fault is that? Whose actual fault is it that they built this railway and it makes huge losses? I would say it's the Kenyan government's fault. They were warned this project would never make money, and yet they continued to look for supporters of it, and then they accepted Chinese investment when it came along. However, saying that, if we take just a step backwards, there is a case that Chinese investment should be kept in perspective. You noted it is China is Africa's largest trading partner, but it does trade about 2.5 times more with the EU than it does with China. So if we're looking at the EU as a whole, and it is the biggest investor on a year-by-year basis. It's gone from just 75 million to 4.2 billion in 20 years. So that's a huge amount. The US is behind at about 2.1 billion. So that's substantial. However, saying that, if we look at total foreign direct investment in Africa, it's only fourth. Number one, the Netherlands. Number two, the UK and France, or number 2 and 3 are UK and France, and then it's China. So the UK, Netherlands, and France are all on about 65 to 70 billion total foreign direct investment stock. China's on 40. So sure, it is growing and it will be up towards the Netherlands, UK, France levels soon, but it's not that behemoth yet, at least. Do I think it likely will be? Yes, if governments continue to accept Chinese money for projects that aren't going to be successful, probably.
Yeah, my view, Alex, is that we as Africans, I think we should stop blaming or saying that we are the victims of, this superpower or that superpower or that, We have allowed the Chinese government to come here and do what it does, right?
Mm-hmm.
We cannot keep on saying it's them, it's not us. The Chinese came here, they are doing what they are doing. We should just lay it out. At whose permission?
Yeah.
Who granted them that permission? Africans did that. So Africans need to look within if they want to sort out these issues. They must look within. The reforms, the internal, domestic, continental reforms must take place. Reforms that will hold leaders accountable, the leaders who sign dodgy deals with communist parties of the world or other, deals that really don't benefit the people, but rather benefit the Africa's political elite. So that Africa, Alex, got independence, or there was the wave of independence from former colonial masters began in early 1960s. That was the wave in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, where African countries were getting independent, that was back in 1960s, right? So it's been a while since we became independent states, right? Now, some will argue that, well, we still have the Western influence. France is still, very much active and controlling its former, colonies in Africa. Look, but if the people of those countries do not reform so that they can counter France's influence or US influence or Chinese influence, whatever, if they cannot reform to counter these such things, then who should we blame? Why should we keep on blaming, other people? So for me, this is the 21st century, Alex. I'm very much thinking that Africans now need to deal with their issues, and there has to be trade. We have to trade with everyone, Alex. Whom we think we can benefit by trading with. US, EU, Latin America, Middle East, the Chinese. We should trade with anybody. But in our trading, we must look at, are we over the short and long term, and on net balance, are we benefiting as Africans? We need to think about that, because I think that thinking from our leaders is it's kind of missing. But I want to talk about how should Africa respond to this thing now of this? Because you said earlier that Blinken wasn't that confrontational a year or 2 years back, right? Yeah. But with this trip, he has been confrontational, sort of laid out that China is not really a good guy, that we need to be careful of them. Spoke about the advantages, at least from his perspective, of democracy, democratic values. How does Africa deal with this thing? How do we strategize as a reaction or response to these forces coming in now, as some people argue that there's a new Cold War coming through? How should we position ourselves, Alex?
Well, very carefully. If we think back to the Cold War and what it meant for Africa, it meant a lot of different things. Firstly, there's the Soviet Union bankrolling many socialist dictators.
Yes.
However, you also did have the West backing many unsavory leaders just because they said publicly that they liked capitalism.
Yeah, the West, that's a very good point, Alex. The West was going around funding dictators, holding hands with them for decades.
Yeah, and even it continues today, and this is a problem of just foreign aid in general. I mean, who's been one of the biggest recipients of aid throughout since the 70s, 80s? Ethiopia, and it continues to be so until about last year, I think, when the UK really slowed down on how much it gave. But we saw just last year, the Ethiopian government was bombing its own citizens. So it's not just, so yes, the Soviet Union bankrolled a lot of unsavory socialist dictators, but the West also bankrolled some unsavory capitalist dictators.
Yeah.
And what I would be careful about if I was not necessarily an African government, but an African citizen, is being really wary about a lot of this foreign aid coming in, because I think this is a bit different from foreign direct investment, but foreign aid coming in, because this can really poison a government. I'm going to butcher this quote, but there's a great economist called Angus Deaton, and he says something along the lines of, poverty is caused by poor institutions, poor government, and toxic politics. Therefore, giving money to poor countries, particularly to governments of these poor countries, will just perpetuate and prolong poverty, not eliminate it. And this is something we have to watch out for, because when huge sums of money come from whatever country, it means that these corrupt, I'm not saying all countries, governments are corrupt, but those that have the most toxic governments, they can then afford to survive and continue pushing their awful policies that don't promote growth, that undermine property rights, that aren't supportive of free trade. And this isn't even me, just a radical libertarian saying this. In 2012, the president of the World Bank, Ban Ki-moon, he said that he suggested 30% of aid failed to reach its final destination because of corruption. Paul Collier, a professor at Oxford University, he says that 40% of Africa's military spending is inadvertently financed by aid. So we need to be really careful about these huge sums just being pummeled in to African states. And the World Bank has done, even though they don't want to admit it too publicly, if you dig into their research papers, you can find this. They found no evidence that aid promoted democracy in a study they did from 1975 to 2000. And that's a quote, no evidence that aid promoted democracy. And they also found, the World Bank also in a different paper actually, found no correlation between aid spending and economic growth. So these huge sums are being piled in, we have to watch out for, because it makes makes all governments, but say in this case, African governments, much more loyal to whoever's giving them the money than their own citizens. And if they're not listening to their own citizens, what incentive do they have to try and implement good policies to help these citizens? They don't. They just have, it's actually a mere incentive not to grow, because if they don't grow, they get even more aid money. So it's something we have to watch.
Yeah, no, it's the foreign aid issue. I'm glad you are raising that, because it's been really something that has been quite a negative for Africa. And saying that is sometimes, or I should say most of the time, an unpopular sort of view. But I like that point, because I don't think that's widely spoken about in Africa. How damaging foreign aid has been to the continent. So, Alex, we have 5 minutes, and I just want to gather from your perspective here. You are in London. You live in London. You do a lot of work looking at Africa from afar. How do you see the future of Africa in relation to the US relations? How do you see it as something that looks good? Are you optimistic or pessimistic about it? How is it likely to play out?
Yeah, so I initially thought you were going to ask, what do I think about the future of Africa? And I was going to respond, overwhelmingly optimistic.
Yeah, you can
Africa's got
answer that
everything.
question I didn't ask as well.
Africa's got everything it needs to be amazing, just apart from, if we're talking broad terms, the policies. It's got everything else is there: the young population, the resources, the drive, the even the culture of entrepreneurialism, I'd argue too, in many places. Just not the policies. Now, the US, Africa with the US, it's hard to say. I mean, in a couple of years, we're going to have a new, we might have a new, we'll have a new president in, have a new administration in, and it seems this strategy changes, but kind of stays the same each time. I'm not too optimistic that there's going to be much of a change. Potentially, with the rise of China and Russia in Africa in recent times, obviously there's a great history, but more prevalent in the last decade than they were in the decade before. There could be a hope. One could hope that the US will see sensible policies to increase its ties with Africa and to really help African citizens, like I say, eliminating subsidies, expanding AGOA. There's also things like visas, making it easier for people to get, I don't know, visas for training schemes or internships, or for businessmen and women to visit America and for them to trade easily without having to worry about too much regulation. However, I just don't see how that's going to come in and who could drive that, especially in a Biden administration. What do you think? Are you optimistic? I know we don't have much time, but how's the future going to go?
Well, I mean, Alex, I'm very critical of Africa, but I'm critical of yes, I do criticize the citizens for not really taking the initiative to push back against the abuse of power or the mismanagement of countries by leaders. I do criticize citizens in that aspect. But I also must criticize, I do criticize leaders as well. You mentioned the word policy. I also have a view that Africa does have potential. My country, South Africa, does have big potential. It just needs policies that will encourage market growth, that will encourage free trade, that will basically really allow an environment that is driven more by business. Business in Africa needs to be seen as an instrument to end poverty. And I'm not seeing that. And that is a policy issue. So you've mentioned the young population, awesome stuff. So we need to pursue policies that will ensure that our economies they become more and more sophisticated, and it's doable. Singapore went from poverty to being one of the richest, if not the richest country in the world. So I mean, it's all policies, Alex. If we can have the right policies and stay away from the statist, socialist way of organizing economies in Africa, and this notion that the state will do something, the state is more caring to people. If we can get off that mentality, change the attitudes, and be more of business friendly, people who believe in individual freedom and other matters as well, we can really make some huge gains. So that's just my view, Alex.
Yeah, poverty is not destiny, it's not fate, it's not geography, it is policy. And once that's sorted, everything else falls in place. And Botswana is another great example. You said Singapore, but Botswana too.
Yes. Mauritius is also, at least in my view, doing well. They've pursued the right reforms. They have something like flat tax rate, which in many countries, that's not there. They are trying to attract as many foreign investors as possible, as many as possible. That is good. So I mean, if we can do the right stuff, Alex, we will take off as well. Even Europe was once poor, and then it went off. The Western Europe, it was once poor, mad in poverty. It was in poverty, but then it went off from there. Alex, thank you so much, sir. It's great to talk to you.
Phumlani, thank you so much. I'll talk to you soon.
Great.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.